The first thing my new neighbor ever said about my 71-year-old father wasn't hello, wasn't nice to meet you. It was, if your old man wants to get to his land, he can crawl the long way around. I remember staring at her because I honestly thought she was joking. Then I looked at my dad, and he just sighed, turned his truck around, and drove away without saying a single word. She thought that silence meant she had won. She had no idea that one chain, one padlock, and one terrible assumption were about to cost her thousands of dollars and every ounce of pride she had left. My name is Ethan Mercer, and I grew up in the foothills outside Ashford County where everybody knew everybody, where roads had stories longer than the people driving on them. My father, Daniel Mercer, spent 43 years building houses as a carpenter. His hands looked like old oak bark, rough and cracked from decades of swinging hammers. But he treated every piece of wood like it deserved respect. He wasn't the kind of man who complained. Even after retirement, he still woke before sunrise every morning, poured black coffee into the same faded thermos he'd owned for 20 years, climbed into his old pickup, and drove the gravel lane behind our family property to check the back pasture and the little grove of walnut trees he'd planted with my grandfather. That lane wasn't anything fancy. It curved past 3 giant white oaks, an old leaning mailbox with faded blue paint, and a weathered limestone marker my father had buried himself when he was barely 25 years old. To anyone else, it looked like an ordinary country lane. To us, it was part of our family's history. My grandparents had used it. My parents had used it. I learned to drive on it before I was old enough to have a license. Nobody questioned it because nobody needed to. Then everything changed when the Harrison estate sold. The front parcel, the one our easement crossed for less than 300 feet, had belonged to the same elderly couple for nearly 30 years. They never cared that my father drove across it because they understood what the deed already said. When they moved into assisted living, a woman named Vanessa Cole bought the property. She arrived with contractors, luxury SUVs, expensive landscaping crews, and the kind of confidence that usually comes from believing money solves every problem. The first week, she smiled and waved. The second week, she started asking questions. I heard later that she'd cornered one of the concrete workers and asked, "That gravel lane belongs to this property, right?" The guy shrugged and said, "Looks like it does." That careless answer became the foundation for every bad decision she made afterward. She never visited the county records office. She never hired a surveyor. She never asked my father. She simply assumed that because the dirt sat inside the boundaries of the parcel she'd purchased, she could control who drove across it. Within a month, decorative fencing appeared along both sides of the lane. Then came landscaping boulders, flower beds, and finally a beautiful black steel gate with heavy posts sunk deep into fresh concrete. The day the chain went up, my father climbed out of his truck and politely knocked on her front door. I wasn't there, but he later repeated the conversation almost word for word. "Morning," he said with that calm voice he always used. "There's a recorded easement through here. I've been driving this lane since Jimmy Carter was president." Vanessa crossed her arms and smiled without warmth. "Well, things change." Dad nodded once. "Not recorded easements." She laughed. "Everything has a price. $200 a month, and I'll unlock the gate whenever you need through." My father actually thought she'd lost her mind. "I'm not renting something my family already owns the right to use." Her smile disappeared. "Then enjoy the scenic route. Maybe it'll give you time to think." She shut the door before he answered. From that day forward, he drove an extra 11 miles around the county every single trip just to reach land he'd legally been accessing for decades. Every extra mile burned fuel he didn't need to waste. Every extra minute stole time from a man who had already given most of his life to hard work. The part that hurt me wasn't even the inconvenience. It was the way he accepted it. When I called every Sunday, he'd simply say, "Don't worry about it, son. Some fights aren't worth starting." But the weekend I came home, I found him sitting quietly in his truck with the engine off, staring through the windshield at that chain stretched across the lane like someone had locked away 40 years of memories. He didn't look angry. Somehow that made it worse. I climbed into the passenger seat, and neither of us spoke for almost a minute before I finally asked, "Dad, why haven't you called anybody?" He gave a tired little shrug and said, "Because I figured she'd come to her senses eventually." I looked back at that shiny new padlock catching the afternoon sunlight, and something inside me settled into absolute certainty. If she was betting on my father staying patient forever, she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. That night, I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing my father sitting there behind that locked gate, not because he was afraid to stand up for himself, but because somewhere along the way he'd convinced himself that peace was worth more than being right. I respected that. I really did. But patience only works when the other person still has a conscience, and something about Vanessa told me she'd mistaken kindness for surrender. Around 6 the next morning, I unlocked the old fireproof cabinet in Dad's workshop, the same rusty gray cabinet that smelled faintly of sawdust and machine oil no matter how many years passed. Inside were folders going back decades, property tax receipts, surveys, insurance policies, permits for barns that no longer existed, handwritten notes from my grandfather, everything carefully labeled in my father's neat block handwriting. He smiled when he saw me digging through it. "You're wasting your morning," he said. "No," I answered without looking up. "I'm finding out exactly how expensive her morning is about to become." About 20 minutes later, I found the document I was hoping existed. It wasn't flashy, just several yellowed pages recorded in 1979 with the county seal stamped across the corner. There it was in plain English. A permanent ingress and egress easement benefiting our parcel and burdening the front parcel forever, binding all future owners regardless of transfer. I read the paragraph 3 times just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. Then I noticed something even better. Buried halfway through the easement agreement was a maintenance clause stating that no owner could obstruct, narrow, block, gate, fence, or otherwise interfere with lawful passage. And if they did, they would be financially responsible for immediate removal and restoration. I actually laughed out loud. Dad looked up from his coffee. "What's funny?" I slid the paper across the table. "She spent thousands building something the deed, literally, says she'll have to pay to tear down." Even then, he wasn't interested in revenge. He simply shook his head and said quietly, "I'd rather have my road back than embarrass anybody." That's who my father has always been. Me, I inherited more of my mother's stubborn streak. Before breakfast was over, I had already called the county surveyor's office. The receptionist transferred me to a surveyor named Harold Benson, a gray-haired man whose voice sounded like gravel rolling in a bucket. He listened patiently while I explained the situation. When I mentioned a recorded easement and newly installed fences across it, he interrupted me. "Do you have a recording number?" I read it to him. A keyboard clicked for several seconds before he whistled softly. "Well, that's still active. Can someone verify it on site?" I asked. "Tomorrow morning," he replied. "I'll bring county records with me." My next call went to the sheriff's office. Deputy Lucas Grant answered, and unlike the dramatic television version of law enforcement, he sounded calm and practical. I explained that we weren't asking anyone to arrest a neighbor. We simply wanted the peace kept while a legal easement was inspected. He agreed to meet us there. News travels quickly in small communities. By that afternoon, 2 neighbors had quietly wandered over while Dad was repairing a tractor tire. Mrs. Holloway, who'd lived down the road for nearly 30 years, leaned on the fence and whispered, "She tried telling me your father needed permission to use that lane now." Dad just smiled politely. "Well, apparently I forgot to ask." Even she laughed. The following morning the air felt unusually cool for late summer. I arrived before 7. Dad was already waiting beside his truck, wearing his old denim jacket, even though the temperature didn't call for it. I knew that jacket. He wore it whenever something mattered. At exactly 7:30, a white county pickup rolled onto the shoulder. Harold climbed out carrying a bright orange measuring wheel, rolled survey maps under one arm, and a GPS receiver over his shoulder. 10 minutes later, Deputy Grant arrived in a marked cruiser. He walked over, shook my father's hand, then mine, before asking only one question. "Everybody planning to stay civil today?" Dad answered first. "Absolutely." I smiled. "As long as nobody locks another gate while we're standing here." About that moment, Vanessa stepped outside, carrying a travel mug and wearing expensive sunglasses despite the cloudy sky. She stopped when she noticed the county truck. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Harold introduced himself. County Surveyor's Office. We're here regarding a recorded easement. Her expression barely changed. There isn't one. Harold smiled politely. We'll let the records answer that. She folded her arms. This is my property. Deputy Grant nodded. Maybe. That's exactly why we're here. The survey took nearly 40 minutes. Harold walked the line with remarkable patience, occasionally stopping to compare field measurements with his maps. He drove temporary stakes into the ground, marked fluorescent paint beside the gate posts, and finally rolled his measuring wheel directly beneath the chain that blocked the lane. Several nearby neighbors had quietly gathered across the road, pretending to check their mail while watching everything unfold. Nobody spoke. Everyone simply waited. Finally, Harold stood up, dusted off his knees, and looked directly at Vanessa. Ma'am, the easement is exactly where the recorded plat says it is. She frowned. That's impossible. He pointed calmly at her decorative fence. This fence crosses it. Then he pointed at the second fence farther back. That one crosses it too. Finally, he rested his hand against the heavy steel gate she'd been so proud of. And this gate sits almost perfectly centered inside the easement. She laughed once, sharp and dismissive. Well, I paid for all of it. Harold nodded. I don't doubt that. Deputy Grant finally spoke. Paying for something doesn't automatically make it legal. Vanessa's voice hardened. This road cuts through my land. I unfolded the old document from its protective sleeve and handed it to Harold. He adjusted his reading glasses and slowly read aloud, so everyone standing nearby could hear every single word. A perpetual easement for ingress and egress shall remain unobstructed for the benefit of Parcel B and shall bind all present and future owners of Parcel A. He lowered the page. That's about as clear as legal language gets. Vanessa looked at me instead of him. You're twisting old paperwork. I answered as evenly as I could. No. I'm reading paperwork you never bothered to. She pointed dramatically toward her expensive steel gate. That gate proves I own this entrance. Deputy Grant couldn't help smiling. Mang, a finge provisionivet a contractor. A recorded deed proves property rights. The silence that followed was almost uncomfortable. For the first time since we'd met her, Vanessa looked uncertain. She reached for her phone and stepped away to make a call. We all knew it was probably her attorney. 20 minutes later, she returned, looking noticeably less confident. My lawyer says we should discuss this. Harold slowly opened the easement packet one more time and flipped to the maintenance clause I'd already memorized. Then, with almost perfect timing, he read the sentence she'd never imagined existed. Any obstruction placed within the recorded right-of-way shall be removed immediately at the expense of the party creating said obstruction, including all costs necessary to restore full access. Vanessa blinked. At whose expense? Harold looked at her with genuine sympathy rather than satisfaction. Yours. Before anyone could say another word, Deputy Grant accepted a printed notice from Harold, signed the witness section, and handed the document directly to Vanessa. It was an official county compliance order requiring every fence, every post, every section of chain, and the entire steel gate to be removed within 10 calendar days or face escalating daily penalties. She stared at the paper for several long seconds, as if hoping the words might rearrange themselves into something more favorable. Then she looked at my father. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply picked up his coffee thermos and quietly said, I told you there was an easement. Somehow that simple sentence landed harder than any insult ever could. As we walked back toward our trucks, my phone buzzed. It was one of the neighbors texting a single message. She just called 3 different contractors. None of them will touch it until her lawyer calls back. I looked over my shoulder one last time. Vanessa was still standing beside that locked gate she'd been so proud of only a few days earlier, clutching the compliance order with both hands while staring at the chain that had suddenly become the most expensive mistake she'd ever made. 3 days later, I heard the unmistakable sound of diesel engines before I even turned on a county road, and when I came around the bend, I couldn't help smiling because the same driveway that had welcomed a crew to build those fences was now hosting another crew hire to erase them. 2 flatbed trucks, a skid steer, a concrete saw, and half a dozen workers stood around waiting for instructions while Vanessa paced back and forth with a clipboard in one hand and her phone in the other, arguing with someone who was almost certainly her attorney. The irony wasn't lost on anybody. She had spent weeks supervising every decorative detail, choosing the style of the gate, the color of the powder coating, even the landscaping around the entrance. And now every single piece of it was marked for removal because she'd skipped the one step that actually mattered, reading the deed attached to the property she had purchased. My father pulled up beside me, rolled down his window, and quietly said, "I wish it hadn't come to this." That sentence summed him up better than anything else ever could. He wasn't happy she was losing money. He wasn't enjoying her embarrassment. He simply wanted the lane back. Harold Benson arrived a few minutes later to verify compliance with the county order. He walked the easement one final time, confirmed the boundary stakes hadn't been disturbed, then nodded toward the crew leader. Everything inside the marked corridor comes out. The foreman tipped his hard hat and got to work. The first loud crack echoed across the valley as a cutoff saw slice through the steel hinges holding the gate in place. Sparks jumped into the morning air. Moments later, the skid steer lifted the heavy gate off its posts as if it weighed nothing. For weeks, that gate had represented control, arrogance, and the belief that money could rewrite history. Watching it hang from nylon straps before being lowered onto a flatbed trailer felt strangely symbolic. One of the workers joked, "Nice gate, wrong location." Even a couple of deputies standing nearby smiled at that. Vanessa didn't. She marched over to Harold, holding a stack of invoices. "This is costing me thousands." Harold answered without raising his voice. "Respectfully, ma'am, the easement was already there when you bought the property." She looked toward me as if expecting sympathy. I honestly didn't feel satisfaction the way I'd imagined I would. What I felt was disappointment that something so avoidable had ever reached this point. "Nobody wanted this," I said. "Dad asked you to read the paperwork before any of this happened." She looked away because there wasn't really anything left to argue. By lunchtime, the decorative fencing was gone. By mid-afternoon, the concrete around the gatepost had been broken apart, loaded into dumpsters, and hauled away. The county inspector documented every stage while the survey crew confirmed the full width of the easement had been restored. A week later, the final invoice became public record. Between demolition, disposal, restoration work, survey verification, and county penalties, Vanessa ended up paying a little over $4,600, not including the legal fees her attorney billed for trying to defend a position that never existed in the first place. Early the following Saturday, my father climbed into his old pickup before sunrise, just like he had done for decades. This time there was no chain, no lock, no detour, no extra 11 miles winding through back roads. I followed him at a distance because I wanted to remember the moment exactly as it happened. He drove slowly beneath the branches of the 3 old white oaks, almost as if he were greeting old friends. He eased past the limestone marker he'd buried with my grandfather all those years ago, reached the leaning blue mailbox, stopped, climbed out with a screwdriver from behind the seat, tightened 2 loose screws, straightened the post a little, and stepped back to admire it. I laughed because that was such a dad thing to do. After everything that had happened, after lawyers, surveyors, deputies, county orders, and thousands of dollars in consequences, the first thing he cared about was fixing an old mailbox that had been standing there longer than Vanessa had even lived in the county. As I walked over, he rested one hand on the weathered wood and quietly said, "Some things are worth taking care of because they've taken care of you." I don't think he was talking about the mailbox. Across the road, I noticed Vanessa standing silently on her front porch. There were no sarcastic comments this time, no demand for monthly payments, no speeches about private property. She simply watched my father drive through the easement she'd once claimed belonged to her, and for the first time since moving there, she seemed to understand that ownership isn't determined by confidence, expensive landscaping, or who builds the tallest gate. It's determined by facts that existed long before either of us showed up. Looking back now, I don't think this story is really about winning an argument. It's about how easily pride can convince people they're entitled to something that was never theirs in the first place, and how dangerous it is to mistake a quiet person's patience for weakness. My father never threatened her. He never shouted. He never touched that gate. He simply trusted that the truth, backed by the right documents and the right people, would eventually speak louder than anger ever could. And in the end, it did. So now I'm curious what you think. If you had been in my father's position, would you have stayed patient as long as he did, or would you have pulled the deed on day one and forced the issue immediately? Let me know down in the comments, because stories like this always seem to divide people. Some believe good neighbors deserve second chances. Others believe actions have consequences the moment you cross the line. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes kindness and weakness are the same thing. Because sometimes the quietest person in the room is simply waiting for the truth to catch up.